Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Yep. For those of you who don't know me, I am Kelly Sims Gallagher. I'm the Dean of the Fletcher School. I am also Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy, and I want to welcome all of you to the second day of the Tufts Energy Conference. I'm delighted to be here with you at one of our signature student-run conferences. And while we're not supposed to have favorites, this is one of my favorites because it's energy, and I love energy. And really, this conference is a great way for students and staff and faculty at Tufts to gather together to discuss the latest developments in the energy transition to a cleaner future. And this year's theme, Innovation Odyssey, Climate Tech and Economics of the Energy Transition, is a really great fit for today's keynote speaker. And it's really a delight for me to be the one to introduce him here today because he's someone I've known for a long time and have admired. And it's great to reunite and have him here with us. He's currently the Innovation Fellow at MIT, where he's focusing on the impact of economic policies in the United States and how that is influencing industrial behavior and also promoting investment into climate-related goals. Prior to his position at MIT, Brian was President Biden's top economic advisor, where from the White House, he helped to shepherd several landmark laws through Congress, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And together, these three pieces of legislation represent, in my mind, the first major climate legislation that we've had in the United States. So a signature major achievement. Before serving in the Biden-Harris administration, he was the global head of investing at BlackRock. And before that, he and I worked together in the Obama White House, where he helped first rescue the U.S. auto industry, and later, and this was when I worked with him, served as the president's top advisor on climate policy. He also was deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget and deputy director of the National Economic Council. And I can personally attest that he was one of the key champions of the Paris Climate Accord within the climate administration, the Obama administration. And you know, probably most importantly, I think that Brian was one of the first people in the United States to understand the foundational importance of having job creation and economic growth underpin climate policy. He's also one of the few people who've been able to actually turn this vision of low carbon growth into reality here in the United States. So please join me in welcoming my old friend, Brian Deese.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start with two notes of personal privilege. The first is to both thank you, Dean Gallagher, for your invite, and also to say to all of you and the Tufts community how fortunate you all are to have Dean Gallagher as your dean, because in addition to her intellectual and academic capabilities, which are well known, she's also an extraordinarily effective climate policymaker and diplomat, and really great person. So you are all fortunate to have her as your dean, and I'm fortunate to have her as my friend. The second note of personal privilege is I believe that the last time that I was in this building was in 1995, when I was a high school student participating in Model UN. And as I was walking in this morning, I was remembering vaguely being here. I can't remember which country I represented. I also can't remember the crisis scenario that we were dealing with. But I do remember that we won, and I do remember that we solved climate change in the context of it. So so great things can start here. So it's a Friday morning. We all need to wake up a bit. And so what I'm going to do, I've got a set of remarks that I want to get through, but I'll try to move through them relatively quickly. And I want to encourage you all to think about these issues as we go, and as you have questions, or as you have counterpoints to everything that I'm going to say. I'd really encourage you to speak up, and I'm looking forward to second half of our time here being a conversation. What I want to do is go right to the core of this conference and talk about the economics of the energy transition. As you said, Dean Gallagher, there's no more fun topic for me to talk about, so that's great. But I want to quickly cover three things. The first is to do a quick refresher of the economic theories and the economic policies that have undergirded this burst of policymaking over the last couple of years. Second, just a mark to market on how are we doing? How are we doing those theories now in practice? And then the third is where we need to go from here. And just to put the bottom line up front, where I think that we need to go is to take this now historic emerging American clean energy strategy and take it global, and take it and use it to massively accelerate decarbonization in the global South. So we'll get there, but before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about where we've come on the economics, and then on practical implementation. So the first on the economics of the energy transition, I think it's important before we get into any of this to sort of level set at just how significant a sea change in economic theory and economic policymaking we have experienced and we are living through in real time. If you think about sort of global economic policy regimes, we have big regime changes, but they happen usually once every generation or generation and a half. They're not that frequent. And if you think about the prior regime as the period from the Cold War to COVID, that roughly 30-year period, I think you can shorthand that economic era as an era of markets and integration. And we have left that era and are now entering a new era, which I think you could shorthand as an era of fragmentation and resilience. But this change is like profoundly important. It operates behind almost everything that we're going to talk about, because for the last couple of decades, economic policy, both here and around the world, has been crafted based on an assumption that greater integration of trade, of people, of technology, of politics, was almost a natural law, like almost moved just in one direction. And the question was how fast that integration would move. And that dynamic, I think that's my first point I want to leave you all with. That dynamic is over. The Washington consensus that we've learned about, that you all have learned about, is in the rearview mirror. The concept of just-in-time corporate efficiency that drove a lot of the structure of international supply chains for the last couple of decades, it's over. And the concept of a unipolar post-Cold War world where the US was the sort of largely unmatched economic and military superpower is functionally over as well. My former colleagues at the White House don't love to talk about great power competition, but we are now in an era of great power competition. And this new economic regime, a fragmentation of resilience of great power competition, it has profound impacts for every aspect of economic policy, but perhaps no more than the economics of the energy transition. So that's the shift that we're in. And in the early stages of these regime changes, it's actually the hardest to try to predict and understand what the next regime will functionally feel like. And that's a lot of why today we feel a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions about what is the future of the global trading regime? What does it mean to have industrial strategies around the world? All of these questions are hard to figure out the answer, in part because we are at the front end of this era. But when we came into the White House now, I guess 3 years ago, we were actively thinking about how can we reposition economic policy in a way that actually positions us to succeed on clean energy in this new paradigm. And so we operated on a couple of core premises. The first, that clean energy has to be at the center of our economic strategy, not at the periphery. The second is that the right approach to clean energy policy is to scale innovation and make clean technologies as cheap and available as possible, as quickly as possible. And then the third was that if we could do that and reinvest in American capabilities in the right way, then we could accelerate climate progress and decarbonization around the world. And I would just say all three of these in a way are novel. They're all quite personal to me. As Dean Gallagher mentioned, I'm an economic policy person, but I'm also, like to think of myself as a climate person. I've spent most of the last decade sort of operating at the intersection between these two issues. And one of the things you do when you see that is you see the divide between economic policy and climate policy. And that operates not only in sort of academic debates, but in bureaucratic manifestations of this idea that there's a trade-off between the two. And I have worked in a number of situations and in White House context where that manifestation plays out in people feeling like they're not on the same team. And that you're actually trying to achieve different objectives. And so one of the things when I came in and was fortunate enough to become the National Economic Council director at the beginning of 2021 was a commitment that we were going to do things differently. And fortunately, with great partners like Gina McCarthy inside the White House, we really were able to do things differently. And if you look at the trajectory of our policy architecture from Build Back Better on the campaign to the American Jobs Plan in 2021, clean energy policy was actually absolutely at the center of our economic policy. My job was, as Joe Biden's chief economic advisor, was to wake up in the morning and think about how were we going to advance the clean energy agenda. So he always used to give us a hard time and shorthand this and say, this is straightforward. We just say, when I think climate, I think jobs. That's the way of explaining that clean energy is at the center of our economic policy. For us economic policy types, we really like to make it much more complicated than that. And so the theory behind that was to look that for much of the last decade and the sort of the end of that prior era, we in the United States were operating in a low output equilibrium, low interest rates, but also low growth and low output as well, and low productivity. And so to change that, we needed a growth strategy, a theory of how public investment would boost productive capacity and supply. And as you look across our economy, clean energy presents the greatest opportunity in that respect. It has elements of the classic market failure of how do you internalize the externality associated with pollution, but also elements of infant industries and market forcing technology that have huge opportunities from strategic public investment. And so that was the theory behind how and why we could put clean energy at the center of this emerging idea of a new American industrial strategy. The other thing we did in this context was to make an explicit decision to focus our policy on how to make clean cheap rather than make pollution expensive. And this, we're in an academic setting, so I will name the perennial climate economics debate of whether pricing, i.e. making pollution more expensive, is a more effective approach. In practice, for me, as a policymaker, this debate always struck me as academic, with no disrespect to academics or academic institutions. Because pricing is and can be effective. It's always relevant as part of any clean energy strategy. We have advanced pricing strategies explicitly with a new methane fee and the Inflation Reduction Act, implicitly associated with regulation and the like. But what's most interesting and new, I think, in the climate economics field is a growing body of work that recognizes that innovation and deployment incentives can and need to be a more central part of a successful climate and clean energy strategy. For example, just to use the most basic example, if you have $1 to spend to try to decarbonize the transportation sector, you would spend that dollar over and over again to build out electric vehicle infrastructure, as opposed to that dollar to increase the marginal cost of pollution coming from the transportation sector. And so that was the second. That was the second theory. Debatable, provocative, but was our theory nonetheless. And in practice, that played out in the three laws that Dean Gallagher mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act. The process to get from our grand vision of Build Back Better to those three laws was 2 years and messy. And there's no way that I could have said on the front end that we would end up with three laws and that one of them would have been called the Inflation Reduction Act. But, and we could talk about that process if you'd like, but on the back end, that's where we are. We now have an American industrial strategy. We now have a credible strategy to say that the United States can, if implemented effectively, hit our 2030 climate and DC goals. And so it is a big deal that for the first time ever, for those of us who went to Paris and pledged that we in the United States would find a way to get there, we now can credibly say that if we implement correctly and stay on this course, we can hit our 2030 emission reduction goals. So we're a couple of years in. So let me move to the second thing I wanted to cover, which is how do we assess impact? That was the theory in this new paradigm. And how are we doing against that goal? This is a place where my team at MIT, along with partners, has launched something called the Clean Investment Monitor. It's a tool that we use to try to track clean investment in the US and try to answer some of these questions of how are we doing? We just released yesterday, in fact, the full data for 2023. So I'll just give you the top lines of that. Investment in clean technologies in the United States is way up. So last year, 2023, $239 billion in investment in clean technologies. That means that in 2023, clean investment was roughly 5% of total private fixed investment in the US. To put that in context, that's roughly double the share of oil and gas investment in the US. It's roughly equal to all commercial and healthcare construction investment in the United States. So like every shopping mall and hospital and other fixed investment you could think of. So clean energy is starting to become a very big part of the American economy. Underneath that, we see some pretty interesting trends. Rapid growth in manufacturing, just extraordinary growth in manufacturing, principally associated with the electric vehicle supply chain, and rapid growth in what you might call emerging climate technologies, sustainable aviation fuels, carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, tenfold increase in that category in a year. So that those technologies are really on the upward part of the S curve. We also are seeing some concerning signs too. So investment in wind has come off significantly. A lot of that is offshore. You guys are familiar with that in this part of the country, our part of the country. But also, if we look at utility scale clean energy generation, so that's principally wind and solar, 32 gigawatts of installed capacity last year. That's up. It is a record. So we are installing more, but we are not installing at anywhere near the rate that we would need if we were, in fact, going to stay on that path to hit our emissions goals. So that is the work ahead, because we know why that's the case. It's not because investment is lacking. We've changed the economics to make these investments quite attractive. The demand side looks fundamentally different. Our problems there are on the supply side. It's this web of barriers from permitting and siting to the interconnection queue. How do you get that power onto the grid, to upgrades of the grid, to NIMBYism and the sort of people don't want to build where they are, to in some cases incumbent utilities and monopolies explicitly blocking and making using supply side constraints to keep clean energy from the grid. That is the work forward for all of us in the United States, is to actually break down those supply side constraints and deploy like crazy. I have a lot to say on that topic. That would be a whole separate speech. I won't go into that. We can talk about it more. But that is the work ahead. And I would say two things. The first is, in the category of problems, supply side problems when it comes to clean energy are much better problems than demand side problems, because you have the market on your side and you're trying to actually unlock investment that wants to flow at scale. That's number one. And number two, we are now experiencing a highly effective policy mechanism to leverage private investment when that private investment can move. So the last data point that I would flag from our research is that we released yesterday the first measure of not only private investment in clean energy, but public investment, meaning how much did we spend as a federal government in 2023 to subsidize and encourage this. This goes to there's a lot of talk about how much is the Inflation Reduction Act going to cost, and people say, well, maybe it'll cost $1 trillion, et cetera, et cetera. That's fundamentally not the right question, because the right question is, how much private investment are we leveraging for every dollar of public investment that we're using? Because if the Inflation Reduction Act ends up costing more because we're seeing even more private investment in these things we want to see, that's a good thing. So the good news from that is that we saw against that roughly $240 billion of investment, fiscal year, calendar year, but roughly $35 billion of public investment. So if you think about it, we're seeing $5 to $6 of private capital for every dollar of public capital. That's a very good and promising sign. It's close to twice what most analysts expected, which was more like a 3-to-1 ratio. So that's good news. We're at least have a credible path in the United States to hit our climate targets. We have a lot of work yet to do. But that's not the end of the story. As I said to you guys, we need to really focus on where do we go from here. And where we go from here is how, now that we have at least the pieces of a clean energy focused industrial strategy in the United States, how do we actually use that capability to accelerate global progress on clean energy deployment as well? We should start from our strategy, and in an important respect, think of the IRA or these three pieces of legislation as the first half of a bridge to getting to significant global progress. Because that second half is, how do we actually extend the innovations and the cost reductions and the declines in these breakthrough technologies that we're driving here in the United States with public capital? How do we extend those into large emerging market economies in ways that work for their energy systems and their development needs? The potential, again, from this approach is really exciting, because the more demand there is for innovation, the more you can drive down cost curves. This is so-called Wright's Law. And so America can become a global leader by investing in ourselves. That's definitely possible. And if you look at some of the analyses of the IRA, you see that if deployed globally, the cost declines we're driving domestically could have enormous climate benefits globally, which is why, notwithstanding some of the reaction to the IRA, when you dig under it diplomatically in a number of countries, there's a lot of enthusiasm about how do you replicate this strategy globally. The problem is that potential, this third part of the strategy, change our economic strategy, invest in an industrial strategy in America, and then extend that globally, is not self-execute. It's not just going to happen on its own. And that's why we need an explicit international strategy to make this happen. And so I just want to spend my last couple of minutes here laying out to you guys my first cut at what that international strategy should look like. I think that the place to start in looking back at where and when we have done this effectively before in the United States. And that takes me back 75 years ago to the Marshall Plan. I want to put a caveat up front. As a policy person for the last 20 years, I have rolled my eyes more times than you can imagine of people coming in and saying, I have a great idea. We should do a Marshall Plan for X. And sort of blithely saying that as a way of saying, I want more priority for my issue, is a shorthand for why it is invoked. In this case, I go back to the actual history of the Marshall Plan, because I think there's a lot for us to learn about how to operate in the current moment. If you go back to 1947, we faced a fractured geopolitical landscape, and we're in the process of that paradigm shifting a similar paradigm shifting moment to the one that we were today. And the plan itself was born out of General Marshall going to China in the hopes that he could stem the civil war and communist takeover there and have a paradigm that looked more like the pre-World War II order, and failing, coming home, being accused of having lost China by Senator McCarthy, and looking at a new world order of great power, that form of great power competition, obviously the Iron Curtain and the Cold War, and having to ask the question of what do we do in this new geopolitical reality? We've not operated in this regime before. And importantly, how do we exert American leadership and shape world outcomes for the better, consistent with our national interests? And so that was the question that sort of animated the strategy at the time. And I think that today, very different circumstances, but at a moment of geopolitical uncertainty, the question, the reality still is that only the United States has a unique capacity to shape world outcomes. We have a strategic imperative today, a core strategic imperative as being seen as a trusted, constructive force for good. And so therefore, I think the test for American leadership today is, can we advance US interests while demonstrating in our deeds that the US is still capable of helping solve the world's biggest problems? And if we want to answer that question today, that means accelerating the energy transition, because it is the most significant economic challenge we have ever faced. And if we succeed in that effort, it will also be the largest capital formation event in human history. Last point, it is at the core of the geopolitical challenge of our time. It is impossible to extract our geopolitical competition with China from the energy transition and where we need to get. And China's efforts to lead in manufacturing have created asymmetrical dependency. And so without a geopolitical strategy to address that issue, we're going to fail in our core strategic interests. So for all of those reasons, we have a real opportunity today. We have an opportunity to forge a new foreign economic strategy. And I would argue that we should put at the center of that strategy an equivalent of a clean energy Marshall Plan today. So if we do that, that could be really good for American workers. It could unlock this $22 trillion market for American innovators, for American workers, and for the American economy as well. It could be good for our strategic allies and partners in the global South, because they are seeking opportunities to deliver low-cost decarbonization at scale, but they can only do it consistent with their development objectives if it is, in fact, low-cost and at scale. And it could be good for the world order by building a more resilient system of supply and demand and a more balanced and sustainable global trading system than the imbalanced regime that played a non-trivial role in upending the prior economic regime that we used to live to. So that's where I think the potential is. And I would just flag a couple of important lessons from Marshall's time that we should learn today. The first is that the Marshall Plan was unapologetically pro-American. It was an unapologetically pro-American industrial strategy. It was pro-American in its policy design. 70% of the resources purchased US goods and delivered them to Europe. And it was also pro-American in its narrative. In fact, Marshall and his counterparts went across the country and did a roadshow and sat with people in town halls and fairgrounds, universities, and initially, a majority of Americans disapproved of the plan or hadn't heard of the plan. And by early 1948, 3/4 of Americans supported the plan. And it passed with broad bipartisan support, in part because it was framed in the context of an anti-communist agenda, but in part because it was framed as part of a pro-American, pro-worker effort to say, we are going to use this to extend markets for US businesses and US workers. And today, we're very well positioned to make that argument. We should start with this credible and clear-eyed story that we could tell if we were sitting with families in Massachusetts, in Macon, Georgia, in Marshall, Michigan, and say, how is this clean energy Marshall Plan going to be in your core interest? And we are uniquely positioned to make that today because our industrial strategy is working. These investments that I was talking about in the aggregate we are seeing disproportionately go to communities that are traditional fossil energy providers, that are not above average income and above college graduation rates, but to parts of the country that have felt left out of prior economic expansions. We go and sit with them and say, this is the opportunity. We need to take this global. And if we do, it's going to be good for your economic interest. And we're at a moment of increased concern about China's role in the global system. We need a credible and durable answer to that, an answer to the Belt and Road. And those two things together create a powerful case, not unlike the case that Marshall and Truman took to the country. But the other key insight from the Marshall Plan in that era is that our strategies must be generous and genuine. I think this is particularly important today at a moment of war and geopolitical conflict and deep skepticism about the US's role in the world. We need to meet our partners and allies, particularly in the poorest countries, where they are. We need to listen to them, learn from the practical challenges they face, and then show up with the resources to be a committed partner. So we need to be generous and genuine, and also unapologetically pro-American. That's not simple, but I think it's possible, and I think it's what should animate an American clean energy Marshall Plan. On the policy side, practically, what would this look like? I'll be really quick here, but I'm happy to delve into this and answer questions. And we're still thinking about this and trying to flesh this out. There's a lot of opportunity for policy innovation in this space. I think first, what it means is that we would need a clean energy financing capability in the United States with sufficient scale and durability that we could actually deliver with our partner countries. The way to think about that is, in Marshall's era, you had a purchasing plan where you purchased goods from U.S. producers, transferred them to Europe, and covered the differential in price. Today, you want an authority to subsidize or cover the cost of the green premium, essentially the cost between international deployment and American innovation of zero carbon technologies. That authority needs to be broad and flexible and appropriately resourced. And we have a ton of tools in the US government today. The DFC, EXIM, our other export promotion capabilities. We have promising models that we've done bilaterally with countries, the so-called JET-P initiatives and others. There are tools out there, but we need to put this as a different level of mandate, resources, flexibility, and capability, and put it at the core of our strategic foreign policy goals. The good news on this is the Marshall Plan, 90% of the dollars that we used in that context were grants, pure grant funding, because the economics at the time required that. Today, the green premium operates at the margin. And so we should be able to actually flip that ratio and leverage US taxpayer dollars much more significantly. The second big piece of this is we need to leverage all of our tools of international economic statecraft to create supply and demand clubs to create more resilient supply chains around the world. You hear again and again about these challenges around critical minerals, around other inputs and components that go into the clean energy transition, and a lot about China and the overdependence on China in that context. If you take just something like critical mineral processing, not the actual extraction, but the processing of minerals, dominated by China today, we know where we need to get, which is we need to diversify and have more resilient supply chains. That does not mean decoupling or taking China out of the supply chain, but it means having more consistent, secure, diversified supply around the world. And for the United States, it's neither feasible or advisable to do all or most of that in the United States. So if you're going to try to put together cooperative purchasing arrangements or cooperative producing arrangements across countries, you as the United States, we as the United States are going to need to step up with real tools to encourage countries to actually participate. And again, we have models for this. We're starting to do this work. We have experimented over the last couple of years with some of these strategies, including in Southeast Asia, but we need to put the full force of our international economic and foreign policy toolkit against creating those partnerships. last things, we need to radically challenge our multilateral finance institutions to step up to the moment as well. There's been a good and constructive conversation about MDB reform and World Bank reform. That was something I pushed a lot at the White House. We are seeing progress on this front, but it's time to go much bigger. And also, I think, consider financing tools and financing mechanisms that would get us to much greater scale much more quickly. So that's an area where we could do much more. And then the last thing that I would say is that we are going to need to realign our global trade architecture with global decarbonization imperatives. And the prior regime, where trade was defined simply in terms of lowering relative tariff rate barriers and ignoring the deep imbalances, global imbalances between surplus and deficit countries around the world, isn't sustainable on a go-forward basis. We need a new answer to that question. And the place to start from my perspective on that is a harmonized approach to carbon border adjustments, border tariff adjustments. That is a strategy that could effectively hold China accountable for the emissions impact of its state-subsidized production imbalances and could get us to a more sustainable equilibrium. But I will say, beyond China, one thing I want to be clear is, particularly for any of you guys who are thinking about going into international diplomacy, there is nothing that is more tone deaf than to go to some of our allies in the global south and say, I've got a great idea. We haven't lived up to our Paris commitments yet. And so now, instead of doing that, we're going to apply a carbon border adjustment that will make it much more expensive and harder for you to live up to yours. That's not a good place to start. And I fear, notwithstanding the good intentions that Europe has right now in pushing its border adjustment regime, that it risks a lot of that political dynamic of seeming tone deaf to the realities of the emerging markets and the global south. But instead, we can design a strategic approach to border adjustment that actually helps our emerging economy allies accelerate their decarbonization efforts. And there's every reason that we can do this. Like, just one specific, very basic idea is a well-designed carbon border adjustment regime should exempt emerging economies that are meeting their Paris climate agreements. It should also exempt countries that are below certain emissions or income thresholds, because it's not necessary to have an effective regime that doesn't do that. And that actually trains the focus on where the real problems are. A lot of that we should name is with China. So if we could bring those elements together, a very significantly stepped up American Clean Energy Financing Authority, supply and demand cooperative arrangements globally to secure more resilient supply chains, challenging the multilateral institutions, as now's the moment for radical reform, and reorienting the global trade regime, particularly around border adjustments where carbon is the issue. Then I think that we could credibly deliver on the lofty goals of a sort of clean energy Marshall Plan. I get some people will say that sounds too ambitious. Like, we are talking about significant reform and significant U.S. resources at a moment where last time I checking my news feed, we've now funded the government for another 8 days. We can't figure out how to extract any money to protect NATO and our alliances in Europe to support Ukraine. This is a hard time. But I would end by just saying, I would do a thought experiment. Take yourself back to January 5th, 2021. January 5th, 2021 was the day before the Georgia special election and the day before January 6th. And ask yourself, on that day, would you have said that it was likely that 3 years later we would have passed the most ambitious climate legislation in the US, that we would have implemented an American industrial strategy that's reshaping how we think about clean energy globally, we would have sparked an energy investment boom in the United States that has manufacturing construction at levels we've never seen in 50 years? I wouldn't have. You can answer in the Q&A. I wouldn't have, and I was sitting there in the transition wondering how we were going to make progress on January 5th, 2021. So I think the thing we need to try to summon this ambition, though, and this is where I'll end, is to anchor this strategy in our core national interests. We need to anchor the conversation in defining our core national interests being served by helping American families succeed, helping American business and workers export their goods. That needs to mean credibly to them more market share, more revenue, more jobs. And we need to define our interest as securing and diversifying supply chains. And our interests are defined by actually showing strategic allies in the global South that we can still be the indispensable nation and the indispensable partner in helping them solve the biggest challenges that they face. And when President Truman and Marshall tapped into those things, they not only won hearts and minds and opinion, but they also won appropriated dollars. They won votes. And I think that that's what we can and have the opportunity to do today. So with that, I will pause, I will stop, and I welcome any thoughts, questions, provocative responses, or otherwise. Well, you can clap first. All right. I'm going to. All right, here we go.
Hi, I'm Gara from China. Very interesting presentation. Give me many insights. Two questions. You mentioned the Clean Energy Marshall Plan. I'm doing the research on China's Green BIR, Belt and Road. How do you compare these two things? I mean, what we can learn from your Marshall Plan? This the first question. The second one, at the beginning you mentioned you transfer the vision to the 3 laws. I'm interested I want to know, how do you do that? I mean, is that clear?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Okay, that's a quick question.
Right.
Thank you.
Those are two very big questions. Let me give a very short version, a short answer to both. The first, what is the right way to think about the sort of juxtaposition of the U.S. Clean Energy Marshall Plan with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative? I think number one, I want to name and be explicit that a big part of the U.S. doing a Clean Energy Marshall Plan is to have a more credible answer and a viable answer to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And so a part of, I think, summoning American enthusiasm to this project is by recognizing that we are in a different level of strategic competition with China. And if we don't show up with a more credible answer, then we're not going to be in the conversation. We're not going to be at the party, and we're not going to be representing American interests and American jobs in that context. So that's number one. That I think sometimes in climate, and I'll be self-critical as a climate person as well as an economic policy, sometimes in climate contexts, we shy away from the idea of trying to position something as quite explicitly in America's core national security interest because of the reality that there's no solution to climate change without China, that we need to partner effectively with China wherever we can on climate-related issues, that we need to be very careful about not pushing strategic competition into the kind of competition that could actually set us back militarily, economically, on climate. All of those things are true. And the only way you can viably energize the American people to support a big national project is if they believe that it's consistent with the things that they care about. And so we need to do that in this context. Practically speaking, I think that you would want to design the American Clean Energy Marshall Plan to have very different implementation objectives and very different impacts in the countries that you're engaging with, because the U.S. approach is fundamentally an open approach, an open model. We want to encourage more innovation and more investment. Our goal is not to own or dominate or to gain sort of strategic or technological edge from investing in and owning and operating. we were talking about this beforehand. The Chinese strategy in many of these places is actually to go in and purchase and own assets, own mines, own transportation facilities, both to run them and operate them, and then to benefit from the associated ability to capture information and otherwise. That's not the American model. It's not a model that we would be necessarily good at. It's also not the right model that would support American interests and American American jobs. So I think it would be very different in practice. Your second question is, if I think I understand, is we had a proposal, we had a vision when we came in. How did we get from there to 3 pieces of legislation on the back end? I mean, there's a lot to that, and it was a long and circuitous process. I think that and we did not, in the process of that, we made a lot of compromises, and the set of things that we passed was both imperfect and different from where we started in terms of our objective. If I say the short thing, and then I'm happy to, if anyone wants to push me on anecdotes in particular, I can go in deeper. But I mean, the short answer is, we looked at that set of policies and said, anywhere that we thought we could get bipartisan support, meaning we could get at least 60 votes in the Senate, we get Republicans and Democrats to support as well, we were going to try to move as part of bipartisan pieces of legislation. So the principal reason of why there were 3 pieces of legislation is we passed 2 pieces of legislation that were bipartisan, and we tried anything that we could get bipartisan support for to put in those pieces of legislation, because our goal was to try to move as much of this in regular order with as much bipartisan support as possible. There was a big piece of this puzzle that we couldn't get bipartisan support for, in part because of the politics of climate, but frankly, more difficult was the fact that we had to pay for that bill. We had to pay for that legislation, and the sort of the only realistic and sensible way to pay for it was by raising corporate taxes and reducing spending on pharmaceutical drugs. And those are things that are, I would argue, highly sensible policies, but ones that are highly politicized, at least today.
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for coming and speaking with us. I'm Sam, a recent graduate of the Fletcher School, focusing on energy policy. My question is, the climate movement seems to have struggled between proposing ambitious plans, but also ones that can be practically implemented and must be negotiable, at least kind of in the US context. You've been a part of some of the most ambitious American policy for clean energy, but some would say not ambitious enough when comparing to our European or international counterparts, or what's required for us to address our Paris commitments. With your experience in designing climate policy in some of the highest halls in the land, what is your advice on the mechanics of a policy advocate to balance these objectives for new folks entering the field?
It's a great question. The first thing I would say, for those who are thinking about how to use advocacy to advance progress, is to take enormous optimism and energy out of what has happened over the last couple of years. Because if you look at the roots of what got, I started this story in 2020 with Build Back Better, but if you go back in the roots of where did this new approach come from around centering climate action in our core economic interests, centering climate policy in investment that will create jobs and economic opportunity in the United States. A lot of that came out of the Green New Deal. And a lot of that came from both the insight and the impulse and the energy of trying to bring together our climate objectives and our economic objectives and not let anybody separate those apart and say, well, we're gonna stick to our knitting on our economic priorities, and then we'll get to climate when we need to. So both in overall narrative, but also in policy detail, you can see and draw the line from a lot of the hard work of climate activists over the course of many years, and now policy that is law and is in place. We have a national green bank that we're about to deploy $27 billion in equity capital, which I think will probably be I don't know when it'll be announced, but it might be today. you know, we have a civilian climate corps. We have the most ambitious climate legislation in American history. So now your question is, yeah, that's awesome and historic and also inadequate, right? And so the first thing I would say is be a little careful about the international comparisons, because if you go to Brussels or Paris or Berlin or even Seoul or Tokyo today, most of the conversation is, you damn Americans, this strategy is working way too well. It's super, super efficient. And now everybody who wants to invest in building clean energy technologies wants to do it in the United States. And that's making life harder for us, right? So in terms of ambition and momentum, America's clean energy strategy is now something that people are looking to complain about, you know, in the sort of stages of grief. First, you know, say is bad, then complain about, then try to figure out how to copy, and then figure out how to partner with. And we're sort of somewhere in that, you know, those last couple of stages. They realize that complaining about it is not particularly constructive. I think when President Macron came to the U.S. in, I guess, November, December of 2022, right after we passed the IRA, gave a big speech complaining that, you know, it was unacceptable that Joe Biden had passed a piece of legislation that was so focused on U.S. workers and U.S. jobs and the U.S. economy that it was, you know, was not delivering sufficiently for France. And several of us in the White House were hoping that maybe we could encourage President Macron to go to Michigan and give that speech, or go to Georgia and give that speech too. So they've moved forward to that, right? So, you know, I think one of the takeaways from that is to take the lessons of how do you take the climate imperative and put it in the core of our national interest, economic and foreign policy, national security, and then keep it there. And so one of the things I would say, particularly for the climate activist community, is we're going to need in the US to figure out how to be a nation of improbable builders and deploy and build things at scale and at speed. That's not a muscle that the US climate movement has built a lot of. In fairness, that wasn't the right muscle to use when you had a policy regime where building usually meant more incumbent, more CO2 emissions and more power for incumbent fossil fuel producers. In an era where building means fewer emissions and more power for clean, we need to figure out how to do that. But I think one of the lessons of how to do that is, how do we keep that in the core of our, you know, economic and national security interests? I can hear you.
Hi, my name is Planner. And one of the questions that I have is that yesterday and today, two of the biggest barriers that I've heard about the further adoption of renewable energy, particularly in the United States, is that there is a need for more policy as well as a need for more private capital. So the question that I have is sort of twofold. If you were to say that there could be another solution for the further adoption of clean energy, what do you think it would be besides those two? So how would we further unlock private capital for more investment?
Sure. I assume I'm going to answer your question in the context of the US. And if that's not what you meant, then somebody else jump in, which is, I think the single most impactful thing that we could do in the US, now that we have the sort of new policy architecture that we have in place, would be to make it significantly easier to both build clean capacity at scale. And by that, I mean the ability to produce more clean electricity, but also the ability to build the components of what we're going to need to have a clean transportation system and a clean built environment, clean buildings and the like. And very specifically get at what are the actual barriers. And today, those barriers are not clean is way too expensive. It's that it's just too hard to build at scale. And I would start with the electricity system and start with our grid. We're going to need to bring a lot more capacity in, and we have a system that makes it really hard to do that. And that's where I would start. And I think if you talk to, as I do a lot, if you talk to investors in the US who are interested in this space, it's funny you guys haven't asked the question. Maybe it's because you guys are thoughtful about this. But although if somebody wants to ask it, that's fine. You haven't asked the question about, we have an election and, what if, how much of this is going to get overturned and stuff. If you talk to investors about this, the single thing they're the most worried about is, I want to invest. It pencils out better, but I'm worried it's going to take me twice as long as I think to actually build this thing. And I'm worried that it's going to be impossible for me to get an interconnection agreement to actually, so, if I'm building solar, or I'm thinking about small nuclear, or I'm thinking about all these things, how do I actually get that power onto the grid in an efficient and an effective way? There's a bunch of innovation and policy tools to solve that problem. But the other thing that I would call out is, this is where I think we also have to, and this goes to the climate advocacy movement. This is an area where there just hasn't been as much sort of thinking about how you politically organize around policy thinking, because you often throw out things like permitting reform and siting, and it just takes too long to build things, and people go into people start using the passive voice, it is hard to build stuff, right? And then sometimes there is a self-reflective view on the progressive side to say, well, it's all because we're trying to achieve too many good-natured imperatives, and we want good jobs, and we want healthier communities, and you layer all these things on top, and it gets too expensive to build. A big part of the problem is that the people who have money and power in the existing utility system either are incentivized or themselves are financially incentivized to build more capacity, whether or not that capacity is clean, and not to open up the system to allow others to compete with them. For example, by using energy efficiency to compete against new generation. And so the reason why in lots of places, although Massachusetts is pretty good on this front, it's hard to say, if I can conserve an electron versus produce an electron, from a climate perspective, we should be for the conserve an electron strategy. But today, on almost every grid in the United States, you don't get paid equally for doing that. And the reason is not that's not like immaculate conception. It's because there's a bunch of interests with power and money who will make more money if you maintain that status quo. So it's also unpacking and figuring out how to build political movements and power against solving those problems, rather than just saying, well, we have a permitting problem in the US, which we do, but we have to figure out how to solve it.
Sorry, this can be the last question.
Oh, great. Okay.
We can do, if you guys want, we can do a lightning round where a couple of people ask questions. There's a couple of people.
I'll make mine quick because you
Okay.
kind of alluded to it. My name's Ian. I work on physical climate risk models at a startup, but formerly at BlackRock and Rhodium Group. So a few connections there. You alluded to the upcoming election, and my question was more on your last point, the international side. Without really any background in international politics or development, my hunch would be that like massive uncertainty in the U.S. foreign policy and approach to international diplomacy, that uncertainty there kind of every 4 years, and particularly with this election, might be one of the big barriers to kind of implementing a plan like this, where the idea is to build infrastructure that kind of has really long lifetimes, and that partnership kind of necessitates a fairly long partnership. So is that true? And if so, like kind of what are some tools or strategies to deal with that?
Good. You two want to go, and then I'll answer you guys quickly.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Grace. I'm a poli-sci and econ student at Northeastern, and I'm currently co-oping at Wood Mackenzie as a consultant in power and renewables. And so my question was that emerging markets may be wary of entering into a clean energy Marshall Plan with the United States, like due to concerns over developing dependency and overdependency on American technology. So I was wondering how you would account for that and ensure that they're comfortable in entering into some sort of policy agreement.
Hello, my name is Kayla. I have a question about moving jobs back to the US. You talked a lot about how kind of centralizing jobs back in America is a big part of our climate strategy. And I was wondering if you could talk to the shortage of training opportunities for trades and a lot of that work that we're going to need in the US. Well, the issue is less so people not wanting to work, but not having the opportunity to learn the skills to do good union jobs. And so was wondering if you could talk a little bit about policy around filling those kinds of roles. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I'll do the lightning round on this. The first is, look at a very at a higher level. We in the United States face the challenge of diminished influence and capability to affect outcomes abroad when our own politics and institutions don't maintain continuity. And that's something that we've done effectively for the last 75 years. And that's something that is, fracturing and at risk. And the current president likes to tell the story, of the first time that he came in, the first G7 meeting that he had, and he said to the G7, we're back, America's back. And one of the G7 leaders, who I won't say, although I've mentioned his name already in this, said, for how long? And you look at the debate around Ukraine and the commitment to NATO, and so I would not take lightly that risk, and that risk operates across every foreign policy objective that we have. In this context, I think we have an opportunity to create continuity, and it connects to the dependency concern question, the second question, by actually demonstrating that if you have viable, scalable, market-based solutions, where private investment is coming in because the market opportunity is really attractive, then that's a powerful way of actually building practical bridges, even underneath the partisan objectives. I think the other answer, and this goes to the dependency question as well, is that the world is a complicated place right now, and it's always a comparison of compared to what, right? So will there be concern among emerging market economies about overdependence on the US? Absolutely. Will there be concern about wanting to build native technological capacity and then export that to the world because that's politically in every country's narrow interest? Absolutely. But in a world where China is showing up with the Belt and Road, and there are no other people at the table, many countries have seen the challenges of building dependency with the Chinese model in that context. And I think that a seriously generous and genuine US approach would be a much more attractive strategy because it's not building dependency on the US or the US state or any particular US administration. It's drawing a more durable connection with America's economy and American innovators. And at the end of the day, notwithstanding the real challenges to our institutions and our democratic capabilities, we still are the best place in the world to invest in driving clean tech innovation. And we are by a long shot. And we can complain all we want about the ways in which we're not as good at that, and valleys of death, and we don't do the things as well. But if you have $1 to invest in the world and you want to invest in trying to do breakthrough innovation, you're investing it in the United States. And that's true even given China is ahead in many key technologies. That goes to the last point. I love this question because it goes to the heart of we do not have a shortage of workers in the United States. We don't even have a shortage of skilled workers in the United States. We have a shortage of employers willing to pay workers and train workers sufficiently that they will actually be able to flourish. And the good news is that there's no better answer to that than having a strong labor market and a strong labor market-centric recovery. That's what we have in the US right now. The unemployment rate has been below 4% for 2+ years. I keep losing track because every month we break new records. And having lived through the last recovery as a policymaker, when we didn't get back to 4% unemployment for 7 years, that is the power that gives workers, and particularly workers in the bottom half of the income distribution, leverage and power. And what we've seen is that, we've seen this over and over again. You see employers complaining, we can't find any jobs, we can't find any workers. And then one of their competitors goes out and offers to pay 20% more, and they find plenty of workers. That's sort of the glib answer. The practical answer is, in a strong labor market environment, you have much more opportunity to do really effective training and skill matching, and working with those who are really good at this. Unions, trades, community colleges, technical colleges know how to do this when there is actually a job on the other side. And that's the answer. I mean, and we're seeing it. And today, because employers actually have to compete for workers rather than workers competing for jobs, employers have much more of an incentive to invest in effective job training programs. So we need to do that more effectively. We need to do that at a very regional and place-based level. We need to recognize that the kind of the best version is a partnership between, a local training organization, take like Greater Phoenix area, ASU, plumbers and pipe fitters, and local, employers who are then saying, okay, we know the jobs, they're there. That's going to pull the students in. We know the training works. Let's do it effectively. Somebody's got to pay for it. But today we have more ability to say, okay, well, the employer is going to, if you're going to get a skilled tradesperson in the back end, then the employer should step up and pitch in. So that's when people say, well, we have a worker problem, we have a skills problem. To a point I made earlier, we always have problems in policymaking. If that's our problem, it's like the highest class problem, because we can solve that problem. Like we can solve that problem right now. And so that's where, there's a lot of work to be done. But we should be pretty optimistic about solving that. Thank you, guys.
Hello, everyone. So our next panel will be starting at 10:35, just 5 minutes late to give us a little bit more buffer. Thank you so much, Mr. Deese, for that wonderful keynote. There are some refreshments outside if anybody would like, and we'll get started soon. Thank you.